beyond Earth, giant sequoias, and their struggle to survive our war on wildfires. That may sound like a little bit of hyperbole. You'll have to tell me if you think that's true after my presentation. All right. So this is what we're used to seeing and thinking of when we think of giant sequoia groves, because for basically a century, there was almost no fire in giant sequoia groves. Fire was almost completely excluded. And for a long time, in the late 1800s and the early 20th century, even in the mid 20th century, the assumption by land managers and the public and scientists, the assumption was that fire is the biggest threat to giant sequoias. It's categorically bad for giant sequoias and some giant sequoia groves. And the best thing we can do is keep fire out, suppress fire, stop fires at all costs, any fire. And so, and people were pretty good at it for a long time. Conditions kind of allowed it, and maybe fire wasn't quite as frequent historically as we thought, but whatever the case, it was very effective. There was almost no fire. A few minor exceptions, but for a century, there wasn't any. And that changed a little over a decade ago. A series of lightning fires in pretty much hot, dry, windy conditions where suppression was just not an option, spread through sequoia groves and actually burned, at this point in time, most of the giant sequoia groves in existence, most of the total area, in particular 4 fires that have occurred over the last last 11 years. So, but this is classic. This area actually burned. This is Redwood Mountain Grove. It's an old growth giant sequoia area. This burned at the KMP complex of 2021, one of those lightning fires. These fires are about 85% low and moderate intensity surface fire, and about 15% on average is high intensity fire. But that's what we're going to be talking about mostly because that's what people are so afraid of, and that's what's so misunderstood. But this is what people are used to seeing, and it's beautiful and it's natural. That's great, but it's also not the whole picture. This is a quote from a sign the Yosemite National Park put up at the entrance to the Merced giant sequoia grove, and right below the sign was a sign saying, if you enter the grove, you will be arrested and fined, and the whole area is closed to the public and press. That's a different story. They were doing a logging project in the grove, supposedly to save the giant sequoia grove from fire. And they said, we need to do this because we have to stop the potential for high intensity fire. High intensity fire is the big threat, and we have to make sure to have just homogeneous low intensity fire. And that's what giant sequoias are adapting to. That's what they need. And that's basically what this quote does. It lays out that narrative. Then we got reduce hazardous fuels, and that means removing a bunch of big trees. So not seedlings and saplings. They removed some of those too, but they removed trees over 2 feet in diameter in this grove. All right, so here's why this is so dangerous. And some of the other panelists are going to be talking more about this, but I'm just flagging it initially. So the disinformation, the misinformation and disinformation about giant sequoias and fire is being weaponized, right? The people who are doing it innocently in some cases, and others who are doing it more nefariously. And they're using these narratives to say, look, if fire, and especially high intensity fire, is such a threat to these iconic giant sequoia groves, this is our prime example as to why environmentalists have had it wrong all along. And environmental laws are such a problem. They're a 20th century relic, and they don't really belong in the 21st century. We actually have quotes from National Park Service scientists saying, you know what, the Endangered Species Act is really outdated. The Wilderness Act is outdated. So is the National Environmental Policy Act, and all environmental analysis and public participation. It's outdated. We know that fire's a threat. We need to roll back environmental laws, get in there and do a lot of management. And management means a certain thing in their context. There's legislation in Congress proposing to do just that. So here's the question. Are giant sequoias really dependent on low intensity fire? Is that really how they evolved and adapted, and they just need low intensity fire and nothing else? And are they really threatened by high intensity fire? This is what we're finding when we do research in these giant sequoia groves, and that 15% that burns at high intensity. Those are giant sequoias. This is the Freeman Creek Grove. That's a large crown fire patch. It's deep in the middle of it. And this is typical. Those are, just for perspective, about 8.5 feet tall. Some are 7, some are about 8.5 feet tall. And I took that picture at 5 years post-fire. And this is a pretty typical thing that you find. Those aren't shrubs; those are giant sequoias. There are a few shrubs scattered around there, but this is in the Redwood Mountain Grove, which is the largest giant sequoia grove in existence. This is in a wilderness area. It's in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. And after the fire, immediately the National Park Service closed the entire grove to the public and the press, and has kept it closed this entire time. It is still closed to this day. If you try to go in there and see this, there are signs that say you will be arrested and fined. And so they've been telling the public and the press for years that giant sequoias can't possibly regenerate in larger high-intensity fire patches, especially where they burn particularly hot and it's a true crown fire. And then they need to close it because of public safety. And they need to get in there and do some tree cutting in certain places and do a big industrial tree plantation project in a wilderness area, because there's no regeneration. And we got to do this to save this sequoias, otherwise the groves will be lost. That's what they've been telling the public for basically 5 years now. And this is what you find if you get in there. Now, I only was able to get in there, and Maya and others, and some other folks in the room here, because I was able to get a research permit, and I was also able to get the general access permit to bring members of the public in with me, who are not part of our research team, to a separate permit. And the only reason I was able to do that is I had to threaten them with a First Amendment lawsuit. So there's actually some decent case law saying the public has a right to access public lands to scrutinize questionable government behavior. And they actually backed off on that. That's the only reason we were able to get in there and see this. But those are giant sequoias. This area here, just for example, it has about 15,000 giant sequoia seedlings and saplings per acre. And that's pretty common. Some areas have 1,000, 500, some areas have 50,000. We found last year, on average, 8,000 per acre in these large high-intensity fire patches in Redwood Mountain Grove. And this is another large high-intensity fire patch. This is in Elbert Grove, south of Yosemite National Park. And we did a study in that one too. We found that the very highest end of high intensity, you actually have the strongest and most dense regeneration and the fastest growth rates. That's me there, and Maya and Tanya Chi and Brian Baker in the Elbert Grove study site. And again, we're surrounded by giant sequoias here. That was at not quite 6 years post-fire. And again, this is typical. And here, I love this one, because what we found in our research in Elbert Grove and Redwood Mountain Grove is that there is no negative relationship with shrub cover. The native, what we call montane chaparral, these are native plants. It's a natural fire-following plant community that grows in particular after high-intensity fire. It really can't survive anywhere else. These plants have evolved to only really effectively reproduce after high-intensity fire. And they've been demonized by the Forest Service and Park Service and other agencies. And the assumption was, well, the shrubs will dominate the landscape, and will just be, they call it brush, which in our view is a pejorative term. They call it brush, and the brush will dominate the landscape, and the sequoias can't possibly survive. In reality, these large high-intensity fire patches, some areas have almost no shrub cover. Some areas have 100%. This is 100% shrub cover here. We found no relationship between the percentage of shrub cover and the density of giant sequoia regeneration. Even in areas of 100% shrub cover, it was the same density. And every one of these circles has 1 or 2 tall giant sequoia saplings, about 8 feet tall, growing through. And so if you look closely, you could see them, but they're also about 10 times more underneath the shrub layer, growing vigorously and surviving just fine. And here's the interesting thing. So what we found is that within the high-intensity fire category, everything's not the same. At the upper end of the high-intensity fire category, the true crown fire areas, that's actually where the giant sequoias are thriving the most. That is the area where they're most likely to survive as seedlings and become small trees. This is what this indicates. To the upper end on the right side, that's the highest level of high-intensity fire, the sort of fire severity values, RDMVR. And there's a number of things that the land managers just simply didn't take into account. They didn't foresee, they didn't predict, they didn't know that. They went out right after the fire, months after, and they did surveys and they said, okay, look at this big high intensity fire patch. There's almost no surviving sequoias, and therefore there's no seed source, and therefore it can't regenerate, on and on and on and on. They made the assumption that all the trees were dead. Of course, in high intensity, it's natural for most of the trees to be killed, but they assumed it was essentially all of them. And across the entire high intensity fire patch, they also made the assumption that the crown fire areas, it burned so hot, it would have incinerated the cones. And therefore incinerated the seeds and prevented any potential for sequoia regeneration. So here's what we actually found. Sorry, go back. That is what we call epiclinic branching. The giant sequoias have a 90 million year evolutionary history with high intensity fire, and they have dormant buds underneath the bark on branches and trunks. And after high intensity fire, a certain percentage of the big ones will produce new green foliage, even if they look completely dead right after the fire. And so when we came in 4 years after the fire, we found a lot more live surviving ones scattered throughout the large high intensity fire patch than they thought there were at 1 year post-fire. And that's because of that performance branching. We also found that there was zero evidence that cones get consumed in the crown fire patches. The cones are there. There's thousands of cones just on this one end of this one branch, thousands more on other branches. And this is in a crown fire patch in Redwood Mountain Grove. Same thing here. You can see just on this branch here, you're talking about hundreds just on that's part. So, and there's cones on the ground by literally the millions. So much so that you have to be careful where you walk because you're like a giant marbles. You'll slip on it and fall. So there's cones everywhere. And where the fire did burn hot and actually killed a lot of the large, even though it's the large sequoias, that doesn't mean they're gone. That doesn't mean they have no use in the ecosystem. So the Forest Service and the Park Service talk as if these trees are lost after fire. The reality is, even in the high intensity fire patches, which again, 15% of the total in these big fires, about 25% of the large sequoias survive on average. But the ones that don't, like this one, this is a snag. I mean, look at those cavities there. That's just one little small part of this tree trunk that went up about 280 feet above the ground. In one large sequoia snag, there are oftentimes dozens and dozens of cavity nests created by woodpeckers, and then inhabited years after that by bluebirds and nuthatches and chipmunks and flying squirrels, and then later on by even a number of small mammal species too. And so basically, one large giant sequoia snag is almost like an ecosystem unto itself, and will remain that way for dozens of species, potentially every single year for decades and decades, even centuries. And in many cases, the top will break off, a branch will fall and will pull out a big plug from the trunk, and you'll have these big cavities where larger species like raptors, spotted owls, and other species can nest. Specific fissures will den in these. And so these are really important. It's really important to happen. Now the question is, okay, well, they're regenerating now. What about the future? We have a really interesting example from 1955, one of the few examples of a fire that occurred during the era of almost complete suppression of fires. It's a large crown fire that occurred in 1955. Most of it was not log or planted in a little grove called Cherry Gap Grove. And this is what it looks like today. Almost all of those are giant sequoias, the ones with the pointy crowns. Those are about 140 feet tall now. And it's part of our research team here. It's Michael and Rob. That's an example. That tree is not 200 years old or 500 years old. That tree is 68 years old when we took that picture. It's 5 feet 2 inches in diameter breast height, just to put in perspective. So that's how strongly adaptive giant sequoias are to high intensity fire in particular. You will not see growth rates like that, even remotely close to that in low intensity or moderate intensity areas. It just doesn't happen. You will see germination, you will see seedlings, but it's not the same. And so I'm going to talk about that a little before I turn to Maya. What happens in the lower intensity areas where you've got low and moderate intensity fire? But first off, I want to address very briefly the argument that if we do want more low intensity fire early grows, then we have to log the growths first because they're too dense. Now, of course, low, moderate, and high intensity fire are all natural parts of the fire regime in giant sequoia groves. It's not just high intensity. That's just a component. Low intensity fire is natural, and it's in deficit. But the reality is that there's a half a century of research, mostly from Park Service and Forest Service scientists, telling us that it doesn't matter how dense the forest is. It doesn't matter if it hasn't burned in over a century. You can have fire in the grove if you want to. It could be managed wildfire, it could be prescribed fire, it could be indigenous cultural burning or some combination, but you don't have to remove a single tree or a single shrub. It's simply about the weather. You can do it in natural fire season, you do it in the early part of fire season if what you want is low intensity fire, when it's mild and moderate fire weather, when it's not hot, dry, windy conditions. And that's been proven by half a century of research. So this is what it looks like in the low and moderate intensity fire areas. This is in the railroad fire in the Nelbert Grove. That's a low intensity area in the grove. And low intensity is natural too. It just doesn't give you sequoia regeneration. It will give you it initially, but they almost all die very quickly after fire. This is Redwood Mountain Grove, a low intensity area. You will not see sequoia regeneration there. If you look hard enough, you can find a seedling occasionally here and there. Sometimes you can find a little clump of them if there's a small high intensity fire patch. But basically, by several years post-fire, almost all it's died. It's almost completely absent. Not complete, almost complete. And what is there is growing incredibly slowly and stunted. So this is, again, low intensity. This is Redwood Mountain Grove. This is typical. So here's a basic summary of what we found. In the largest high intensity fire patch that we studied, the largest one in existence right now in Redwood Mountain Grove, we found an average of 8,000 giant sequoia seedlings and saplings per acre within the large high intensity fire patch. That's more than 21 times denser than the Park Service, U.S. Geological Survey, Forest Service scientists projected that it would be by 4 years post-fire. They projected an almost complete loss and decline of sequoia regeneration by 4 years post-fire. They said it would almost all be dead. Instead, it's actually increased. The areas where they planted against the overall objections, we have a lawsuit that Mason's going to talk about that. The areas where they planted, the planted seedlings, 70% of what they planted died within 10 months of planting. And the planted seedlings comprise less than 0.5% of the total regeneration. So in other words, what was the point? It's basically a completely irrelevant component of what's growing out there. Giant sequoia seedlings have the best chance of surviving to become saplings and then smaller trees in the crown fire patches. No correlation between shrub cover and sequoia regeneration, and more sequoias than previously assumed. That's survived. Another study coming out hopefully very soon found that high intensity fire is actually in deficit now compared to the natural levels and rates before fire suppression. This is contrary to the narrative that the Park Service and Forest Service have been telling the public. We have an unnatural excess of high intensity fire that they claim because of overgrown forests, they say, and because of fuel accumulation due to fire suppression. Now, fire suppression is not a good thing. We need fire in the forest, but it has not led to the high intensity fire patches. That's their claim. In reality, it's just about the weather again. These are weather and climate-driven events. And so I found no correlation between how long it's been since the last fire and the level of high intensity fire. No correlation whatsoever, not even close. And in addition, high intensity fire again is in deficit, so is low intensity relative to natural levels. So we do not have an excess level of mortality of larger sequoias. We don't have an excess level of high intensity fire. We're actually still in deficit, closer to natural levels because of recent fires. But we are not even within the natural range of variability yet. And last, we found that based on Park Service's own data that they concealed from the public, but we managed to get, that by 20 years after the low intensity prescribed fires that they say they need to do as the dominant management to prevent mixed intensity wildfires, by 20 years after, in the great majority of these areas, there is 100% regeneration failure of giant sequoias in these lower intensity prescribed fire areas. Those bars represent the percentage of plot locations with zero sequoia regeneration surviving at different time periods. And you'll see on the far right, at 20 years after prescribed fire, 82% of all locations have zero sequoia regeneration that survives. And I'll tell you, in the remaining 18%, there's almost none, and they're tiny. All right. So, bottom line is this: low, moderate, and high intensity fire, all natural components of the ecosystem, but the only place that you really get sequoia regeneration, the only place you get the next generation of sequoias, is in the high intensity fire patches. They depend on it. It's not just okay, it's not acceptable, it's not just acceptable, it is essential. They have to have high intensity fire. And if land managers manage for homogeneous low intensity fire, or even lower intensity fire, low and moderate, that is an extinction strategy for giant sequoias. It cannot reproduce over time in that kind of a fire regime. They have to have a periodic high intensity fire events. All right. More information, if you want, it is in Exhibiting Fires Nature's Phoenix book and my book Smokescreen. And I will turn it over to Mark. Start pulling yourself here.
Thanks, Jack. That was a little bit of a walk down the Sequoia Kings Canyon area. And I started my work in the Sequoias, the giant sequoias, after the Castle Fire, the 2020 Castle Fire. So I want to talk a little bit about that area and share some of what I think are the indicators of thriving life, including the giant sequoia regeneration, the wildlife, what I think about as the wild elders, because they've been around for so much longer than we have, and they know how to get back in there when these thriving systems start proliferating with giant sequoias. Like chart slides, there's going to be a lot of giant sequoia seedlings here and saplings. And this is what I call emerald forests and charcoal trees. And charcoal trees, what Chad is talking about, high intensity fire, where you see the fire torching all the way up to the treetops with the pine cones still intact or dropping down. And then you see all that regeneration.
I can.
Okay, and I can do that. Oh, that's good. Cool. That's a little pine cone, very small pine cone for a very big tree. You can see that the seedlings are very anxious to get going. In fact, they've gotten going within the pine cone. I'm not sure they'll survive, but it was kind of cool to see that happening. And that's year 2 after the K&P complex fire in Sequoia Kings Canyon and Sequoia National Monument and a bunch of other areas. It sort of was a big fire. This is 2023 after the 2021 K&P complex fire. You see the very small sequoias. I don't know if you can see this, but and then you see the year 2 ceilings in the back. And believe it or not, this was 2025. It might have been year 4 or year 3 of this little sapling. It has a cone, which is amazing. And it's been recorded for young saplings or seedlings to have cones. Well, I don't know. I'd call this a seedling, actually, right?
Yeah. Sapling size.
It wasn't sapling size yet. So, wow. That was the one moment. So, and then I am interested in exploring the comeback of wildlife, and in particular within the 2020 Castle Fire area, which is Freeman Creek Grove. Some of you know that there is a George Bush tree in Freeman Creek Grove. I just want to talk a little bit about the things I saw before the kinds of interference. You talk about loving something to death kind of thing, the kinds of measures that have just happened. So that's a little bit, I'm going to start with the happy story, but I have to update you about it. But yeah, went in there starting in 2022. This is just 2 years old. Everybody's just 2 years old here. And they're doing just fine in the snow. I'm very, very interested in the wild elves. Do you want to try this? Playing, Jen? Oh, there you go. So there's two foxes here, and there's a lot of play going on. I see a lot of play. One of the things that are most important that I'll emphasize over and over again is fallen logs. I think about fallen logs as the ticket to the pathways through the forest that animals sort of co-work with that beautifully evolving complexity of the habitat. And these, of course, the fallen logs will fall on saplings and seedlings. That happens too. But they create this incredible maze that, of course, they quickly figure out. In fact, I have footage of a tree that luckily didn't fall on my camera. I leave these cameras out for 3 to 6 months. And I can talk to you a lot if anyone wants to talk about remote camera work. One of my favorite subjects. And I saw this log fall, and the very next day, a squirrel was using that log to bring nest materials into its nest, and it paused right in front of the camera. So it's really cool how this very fast evolving additional complexity, the layers of complexity, bring about more. This is no, I want to go back to that one. Should I keep the one? Yeah, but so there's a fisher here.
Trying to make the video go. But okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Got it.
This is a young, I think it's a young female fisher. Fishers are what I call badass. They're like hardcore. They're small but super ferocious. So really quick. Again, you see her using this log, and I'm seeing that over and over again. And these he marks it, which is also typical. It's like there's a scent here. I want to show that I'm also boss here, right? So that's one of the findings. I mean, once I realized how many animals are in these intensely burnt patches that are now in danger of being lost, I feel compelled to try to figure out, are they actually dead in there? Are they raising their young there? Are we actually getting rid of, in the process of fuels reduction projects, are we actually moving their entire home and house out of this area? So I don't know the answer to that because it's very, very difficult. We have to work with so many different interdisciplinary efforts to figure out if they're really actually maybe living there, which I think, why not? This little fisher is not going to move if the goings are good, and if it can get things, why would it move? And it's a prolific, beautiful habitat full of all the live chat I was talking about. Sorry, I'm going to go forward here. This is particularly interesting. I have deep one older camera and no video capacity on it, but there were 14 videos in a row. This fisher has, if you turn your head that way and look carefully, that's a hawk's head in her mouth. So not only did she get the hawk from the other side of this creek, which is a high intensity area of part of the Windy Fire, she got here, she realized, sat down, she head, I know, gross. And then she went back up into the other side of the creek, which is also a high intensity part of Sequoia National Monument. So she's definitely making a living right here within the high intensity patch. Now, this is a corridor that looks very green because it's riparian corridor. It's right next to the creek. And I think about that as being why fishers got their name. They're always near or in creeks. They don't swim if they can help it, I think. I've never seen that. But yeah, so it's really amazing that she's making a living here. So yeah, back to some of what Chad was talking about earlier. We're I sometimes see these carpets, and you just, you have to do a few miles a day, quite a few miles, like 10 a day in rugged country, but you just have to stop and figure out how am I going to actually walk through this because I don't want to destroy seedlings as I go. So I do know this is very common to come across a sort of a green carpet, emerald green carpet. Once we're in and that's Tanya walking through one of the carpets. Actually, it's a little more than carpet right now. It's kind of going to her shoulders and above. And you could see these beautiful snags with all their complexity in the backdrop. That reminds me of another note about those snags, because I suspect someone's living more than someone is living in them. I haven't found out yet, except for spotted owls. That's the only thing I've found. Yeah, so as Charlie mentioned, a little bit of a reiteration within the high severity patch. I was with Park Service people at a meeting down here in the valley, Redwood Canyon, the Redwood Mountain Grove, and pointed up at one of these trees and say, "Hey, look, that's alive." And the very first thing, one of the people with the tremble, it's lucky I can't remember the name, and I wouldn't say it anyway, but they were saying, well, but how long is it going to be alive? So see, it's funny, to me, the glass is half full and more than half full, but to a lot of people, the glass is half empty. And if you're going to look at it that way, it's sort of a pessimistic way. I want to just keep my time here, so I'll just maybe 2 more minutes. Oops. There we go. This is a video chat. This just chat and Tanya at the end of the day. So it just gives you this. I don't have a band shot of this, but you can see this carpet around them. And these are all randomly selected sites. They were selected before we even got into the field. So it's not like, oh, wow, let's go there because that's really cool. We just ended up the end of the day at one of our last sites. So it's measuring the tallest among these trees and these small seedlings. And at the end of the day, we just count how many there are, which takes a while if you're going to look at a small area which is discredited. And a few more in Redwood Mountain, a few more characters to bring to you. One is the black-backed woodpecker. I'll have a few keychains left, so if anyone wants a keychain, I did a film on a black-backed woodpecker survey series once a while back ago. And so this is a very small bird with a very big personality. If for those of you who've seen him, you know exactly what I mean. And it's feeding its chick over here. This is definitely in Redwood Mountain Grove. It's in a lot of the Sequoias. It's in Freeman Creek Grove. But I do need to share some updates of Freeman Creek. The other character here is Martin. I have to share this slide. It's a little away from the groves in Sierra National Forest, which has an elder grove in it, but it's away from the grove. And this is the only example of a snag in the middle of a high intensity burn with very few in this small high intensity burn, very few live trees in this burn area. It's next to a creek. It's next to a little meadow. And here she is. This is the female Martin, and she's just digging again. I found the footage of her digging, just a little paws going, the dirt flying, and then now she's just made herself at home there. They'll use more than one dip, but it's so cool that she's using a burn snag at first. To me, that's like, okay, that's one of the answers I'm trying to find more of. Pointing to those logs, fallen logs, and that we shouldn't be removing these fallen logs because it ends up being food for bears. It's pretty terrific. This little one's learned, but I think he's still learning because he didn't get anything out of that, and he wasn't really making a huge effort to spray. So let's see. So this is Freeman Creek Grove, and this is what I call loving to death. So we're looking at, I think specifically all the snags most of the snags I've won. There was a couple logical snags. I think they left. I'm seeing that in the background, and it just seems to me that animals are not going to use. They'll use the fallen logs as paths for sure, But if you're looking at taking out so many of these beings, these foundational trees, right, which is our foundation of life moving forward, give shade and moisture to the surrounding little ones that are growing, and they give housing to so many animals. So now you're looking at lack of housing as far as the housing complexes and the wild ones. And of course, they're logging, so they can't really control where those logs fall. And so you're looking at, before these seedlings are really that strong, they're going to be slammed with something, and we just don't know if they're going to survive. But sorry about that. It's just the reality for Freeman Creek. We're hoping it doesn't happen to all the groves. All right. Thanks so much.
All right. Good morning. How's everybody doing?
Great.
Good. Thanks for coming. Um, my name is Mason Parker. I am the Wilderness Defense Director at Wilderness Watch. And I was lucky enough to be brought along for the ride whenever we went into the Sequoia Grove last summer with Maya, Chad, and Adam, and everybody else. So, yeah, I'm going to sort of speak to the wilderness perspective on this, because what we saw out there wasn't just beautiful regeneration, and it was that, but it was really a testament to the intelligence of nature. When given some space and some autonomy to evolve and heal, it's a beautiful thing. So I'm going to talk about the groves from a wilderness perspective. So a little bit of background on the Wilderness Act. So the Wilderness Act was passed in 1964, and it was a response to the rapid industrialization of the landscape in America. At that point, we had highways were starting to crisscross the country. There was extractive machinery dotting the landscape. The rise of chainsaws, in the first half of the 20th century. All of those things called for a designation to protect these places against that rapid industrialization. So what came of that was the Wilderness Act. And currently about 3% of the lower 48 are designated wilderness and have all of the protections given to them by the act itself. This means that there are no chainsaws unless under narrow circumstances, which we'll get to later, no motorized equipment, no extraction, none of those things. And I think that I would be remiss if I did not address a common misconception about the Wilderness Act, which is this word here, untrammeled. Untrammeled is different than untrampled. And I think that this is a confusion that we hear a lot. Untrampled is a condition prior to the designation. Untrammeled, a trammel is a shackle. It's about freedom. It's about autonomy. It's about all that from the point of their designation forward. And you'll hear me say this again and again today. This is a forward-looking act. It's about how we manage these lands or don't manage from the point of their designation forward. So a little bit about wilderness in Sequoia Kings Canyon. So about 93% of the park is designated wilderness. That is, has anybody been out to Sequoia Kings Canyon? Right. So there's a huge difference, right, between walking in the front country or on the boardwalks, and you've got. I think there's like a trail through all of the stumps, right? Yeah, it's pretty rough. But you get out into the back country, and it's just totally different, right? And you can feel sort of that energy of the wildness there. As you're walking through it, it's beautiful. Even when it was burned,
Yeah.
So, so the point being that, by designating that, it was an acknowledgement that that was going to be dealt with a little bit different and managed different than how the front country is. And so in that area, we're going to allow nature to call the shots, even if sometimes we don't like the results. You know what I mean? Um, so that led to the lawsuit. Wilderness Watch, Sequoia Forest Beaver, Tule River Conservancy, and the John Muir Project filed a lawsuit against the Park Service in 2023. So we believe that the Park Service's proposed project was a violation of both the Wilderness Act and of NEPA. So it was a very large scale project. We're talking about the use of chainsaws, the use of motorized equipment, and the use of prescribed fire in wilderness to bring about desired conditions. And this is something that in the wilderness world we're dealing with a lot. It's this pursuit of desired conditions. We see that in a lot of the proposed projects. And, we're of the opinion that, well, wilderness isn't about desired conditions, for humans and for management agencies. So that was the foundation for the lawsuit. And we are still waiting for a court opinion on that. And that was filed 2.5 years ago, and there's not going to be a hearing on it. And so we are waiting for a decision on that currently. So the question that, comes to mind, and how am I doing on time? Okay, cool. Is how do you justify sort of using chainsaws and helicopters and drones and all of these things in wilderness when the act so clearly, says no to these kind of motorized interventions? Well, what we see is a process called a MRAF. Previously was an MRDG, and the agencies will break down wilderness into these competing qualities. The two that we primarily, the big thorn in our side, right, is untrammeled against naturalness. So the justification of trammeling wilderness in order to restore its naturalness. But what we see almost every time is that the restoration of naturalness always supersedes the untrammeled quality. And we believe that naturalness flows from untrammeledness. What is unshackled, wild nature, the result of that is what's natural, not what our desired conditions are. And, the odd thing is that you see what the natural conditions that are proposed in the projects are. It's always it's always what's natural. The desired conditions are also what's natural. So, and to go a little bit further on that, we had a recent project in the Shawnee National Forest in which the project was proposed. There was a lot of burning proposed. There was a lot of vague, thinning proposals, unclear what kind of equipment was being used. That they wanted to. It applied to the entire national forest, and it was about 38 pages. But I complain about these things when they're too big. I complain about PCAs when they're too small. So I guess I'm pleased. So, but I reached out and said, hey, I'm hoping if you're going to use motorized equipment in the wilderness that you've done an MRAF, could you share that with them? And they said, well, sorry, we haven't finished the analysis yet, and so we can't share it with you. And I'm thinking, well, so you've already proposed the project without finishing the analysis? We're going through a public comment period without this information available to the public? I didn't get a response. But so that is sort of how they pit these two qualities of wilderness against each other and then justify using a lot of this equipment that the Wilderness Act would have never allowed originally. And so the other thing that we're seeing right now is conditions-based management, and it is 2.5 million acre projects based on an EA, using no site-specific analysis that will be figured out in the future. And we have pressed back on that, and we asked for more site-specific analysis. We asked for EISs, but we are getting more and more of these sort of massive landscape level projects that they go on for 5-year increments in perpetuity, forever. And so that's one of the things that we are also having to deal with now, and how I think that wilderness sort of gets just lumped into every other land designation whenever these projects are sort of proposed. It's not really treated any different or given any other considerations outside of that. So again, like I said, I'm going to repeat this again and again. The Wilderness Act is not about the past, any point in the past. It is about the future, and it is about how humans practice humility and restraint when managing these spaces into the future. There's these places have never been static. There's no condition to return to, no one point in time to return to. It's an active management strategy of restraint and humility, and allowing nature autonomy in these cases. So that is, in my mind, what wilderness management is versus active management. So and yeah, no pristineness required. These areas are, when they're designated, they're not pristine. Sometimes they're even a little bit trampled. That's okay. So yeah, let's see. So yeah, active management, again, it is showing your worth through, acres treated and fires suppressed, and sometimes, as we say at Wilderness Watch, there's value in doing nothing, So, but that's not to say that these spaces don't have scientific value as well, right? Leopold called them a base datum of normality. So these spaces, wilderness, it's a control against which you can see the efficacy of some of your management strategies outside of wilderness. It's also maybe something we can learn from, like we said, about how nature rejuvenates and how it adapts to the conditions which we are currently forcing upon it, But it also has value outside of that scientific control. So you see higher biodiversity globally in unmanaged forests. And that's because if you're anything like me, you kind of like to turn over the rocks and look at the bugs and see the fungus that's growing on the logs that are rotting on the forest floor and all of those things. Those are the things that are negatively impacted primarily by fuels reductions in these areas. So from the wilderness perspective, deadwoods, it's not wasted timber, right? It's the foundation for the next 200 years of forest health. We don't see, we don't think of a burned forest and think this is an eyesore. We think this is a lush and unique habitat. So, yeah. So I think that just to zoom out here, we like to talk about landscape amnesia. It's hard to know what the landscape looked like 150 years ago, much less 150,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago. Each one of these trees has an average lifespan of 2,000 years. So what is the timeline of the lineage of these groves? And there's a sense of immediacy and urgency, and sometimes that's understandable, right? But time is difficult for us. You've heard the thing, what Cleopatra lived closer to the the development of the iPhone than the building of the pyramids. It's weird. And so like we're this brief blip, and we have a hard time thinking on these huge ecological timescales that these forests function under. And I do think that, bringing that perspective as much as we can to management strategies is important. So, yeah, I think that if we allow ourselves to step back and observe, not only will we see lush regeneration and something beautiful and renewal. But we also might learn a thing or two about how nature adapts and how hands-off management can really bring about what's best for these forests. And I'll leave you with that.
All right. Well, my name is Adam Bronstein. I'm the Oregon Director with Western Watersheds Project. We are dedicated to restoring Western watersheds and wildlife across the American West. And we have a primary focus on the negative impacts of livestock grazing, which is a massive use on public lands. And we'll get to talk a bit about livestock. I kind of had an unexpected encounter in the Sequoias. And I just can't get away from the damn cows. It's really my pursuit in life on vacations. I always try to find public lands away from the cows, but I fail constantly. I'm also the host and producer of Our Public Lands podcast. Some of you might be aware of the program, but you can check it out on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and also on Substack. So I'll be talking about the Save Our Sequoias Act. We'll get a bit into the livestock grazing issues as well. So we'll talk about FOFA. And we'll carry on here. Well, actually, we'll start here with this film that came together. So, I was talking to Chad and Jen at John Muir Project about getting down to the Sequoias this past year with Mason and some other folks, Amaya and Craig Swolgard was with us too. And I just felt a real draw to go down. There was just all these attacks on public lands and seeing the forest being degraded and decimated all around my place and wherever I travel across the public land. I just felt a real urge to really start to document what's happening. And it just broke my heart to learn that we're doing these same sort of management activities in the Sequoia groves. I mean, it's nothing sacred at this point. So this real pervasive ideology and this myth that we need to actively manage forests in order to save them. And we're seeing it in national parks. We're starting to see it in wilderness areas now and across our national monuments. So this is how far it's come. So we came up with this title, The Great Big Giant Sequoia Scam, for the film. This went live on YouTube about a week ago. And it's been well received. We've had about 36,000 views so far. And there's hundreds and hundreds of comments. Well, I'll show you some of these comments here later, but here's some screenshots from the film. There's Chad in his helmet. There probably was a better shot of you, but I thought that was pretty good. So this is in the, let's see, this is the pack saddle grove, I believe. So this is a shot from the film. You can just see some of those big piles. Here's some of the logging there. Just stumps and piles. I mean, these are your Sequoia groves managed by the Forest Service. This is in Giant Sequoia National Monument. This is, it's so painful to witness this, but also we have to recognize that this is what's happening out there, and it's really hard to look at. But I feel like the Forest Service has just completely lost the trust of the American people right now, and Congress needs to rein them in. And we have all sorts of proposals in order to do that, which we're starting to work on and talk about. So here's a shot of some of those ceilings, and we saw those from Maya and Chad. Well, here's some comments from the film. It's lovely to see the Sequoias are bouncing back so vigorously without any human intervention. It's also very concerning to hear that the government is trying to hide this from the public in order to have logging bills rushed ahead and essentially clear cut the forest under the guise of restoration. How sinister. So, you guys can just kind of read some of those, but I really like this one. I went into forestry when I was in my early 20s. I was idealistic and very quickly found that money drives the management of your forests. It is not science. It's not symbiotic with nature. It's for profit, rape of the land. Nature survives in spite of us, not because of us. Mason highlighted that so well in Wilderness. Thank God for the Wilderness Act. There's so many attacks in the Wilderness Act right now on the left and the right. But if you spend enough time on public lands, you visit our wilderness areas, yes, they are under attack right now. And there are some, non-conforming uses and intervention. But just go to those places and see what the condition is like inside of wilderness and outside of wilderness. We have to defend and fight for the wilderness idea. Otherwise, we are completely lost. We are completely lost. Just a couple other comments. The so-called experts in science and, independent scientists have been marginalized for too long. So we're trying to elevate their voices. All right. So the Save Our Sequoias Act. This bill really came out of, let's see, when was this first introduced? I don't have that on the screen, but a couple years ago, after these big fires, a bipartisan bill authored by Representative McCarthy and Scott Peters, and is now sponsored by Rep. Fong out of California. So this was his district, so he ended up taking the sponsorship here. And recently, this just passed out of committee in the House Natural Resources Committee last week. There was a markup. There were some changes. But overall, the bill is still really, really bad. It fundamentally is they want to do what they've always wanted to do with this bill. And the primary objective is to implement these protection projects, I put them in quote, aimed at making giant sequoia groves more resilient to high-intensity wildfire. And you can see through the work of Chad and Maya and others that we just have evidence that is not the case, but it continues to be ignored. And this is where it gets really dangerous, is where those lies get disseminated and told over and over, even though the evidence is right in their faces. It's okay to change your mind, right? We all find out things that weren't true, deeply held beliefs that we've had, these preconceived notions, and it's okay. We can change our minds, and we have to give people space to do that. But when the agencies dig in their heels and they continue with the myths and disinformation, that's when it becomes so dangerous and Orwellian and authoritarian. All right, so lands in Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park, Yosemite National Park, Giant Sequoia National Monument, which is about 350,000 acres, Southern California. So these are the areas that will be targeted. I won't get too much into the bill because it really doesn't matter on the structure, but there's a lands coalition that will come together to oversee and sort of, put these projects forward. They have to do assessments, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really matter again, but so they're contradicting peer-reviewed science. The bill claims that sequoias are at unprecedented risk, and that there's high tree mortality, more high mortality than there was historically, and it claims that these high-intensity fires are just destructive. Again, thinking of those time scales like Mason was referring to, and just what we're seeing out in the field, just this vigorous regeneration after these high mortality or these high-intensity fires. The 20% mortality was, touted by the agencies, and the media really picked up on this, but these just weren't accurate ultimately. And we saw a lot of those giant sequoias coming back right through that epicoric branching. So it's really hard to tell if a tree's actually died initially. So they just did these flyovers and these quick assessments and, the drumbeats of fear. So yeah, we have a fictional emergency, right? We have lots of these emergencies across the public lands, across the nation. So they're using this to scare the public. We're also seeing these categorical exclusions being used more and more on public lands. Initially, CEs, CXs, depending on the agency. These were designed to change the color of an outhouse or to replace a light bulb fixture. But now they're being used for these massive logging projects in a place like the giant sequoias. And there's only 26,000 acres of giant sequoias out there. It just lacks protections and just opens everything up to this hazardous fuels destruction. So I'll kind of go through here for a bit to move on. But so this was a bipartisan bill, unfortunately, and Jared Huffman of California said that this work is important and we need to fund the Forest Service to implement these projects. And I'm just really confused what he's thinking and sort of the political calculus is behind the scene. I mean, they've got to be doing horse trading. The Democrats are great at the horse trading. So this is going to hit the floor in the House. There'll be a vote at some point, but we're going to be fighting this tooth and nail all the way through. And hopefully it just dies in the Senate. We don't want it to pass the House either, of course. And we have the Fix Our Forests Act. The fires in the Sequoias were really used as sort of a cudgel to be able, to promote the sort of active management and wrapping it up under the CEs. But FOFA would authorize 10,000 acre logging projects back to back, would remove judicial review and also eliminate requirements under the ESA. And already now, even without FOFA, we're seeing just mass destruction of the forest. So this would really bring us back to a really dangerous time. So logging removes windbreaks, creates hotter, drier conditions, right? It really impacts those microclimates. So we're destroying the fundamentals of our forests and the conditions that all of these species evolved under. More carbon emissions, and we're taking the focus off hunting, hardening, and defensible space, which is really what we need to be doing. These backcountry logging projects do not help us under the severe environmental conditions. It actually just makes these conditions worse. Wind blows through, the embers are actually usually what takes out structures, not a wall of flames sort of moving through a community. All right, so here's the Paxel Grove. There's a Jen, you can see this is on a giant sequoia grove, folks, in a national monument. Okay, this is kind of off the beaten path, and you can see there's no regeneration. The bulldozers just roll right over everything. Here's another shot. Here's the Nelder Grove, kind of same thing. You can see sequoia seedlings and satellites dead, these big piles. And then here's an example of natural regeneration versus active restoration. Seriously, that's restoration. Okay. All right. Looks like we're on the cow part of the presentation. All right. So I was walking through the groves with everyone. I go, Chad, is that a cow pie? I know what a cow pie is. Yeah, that's a cow pie. So every year that they've been in the Red Mountain Groves, they have documented cattle and told the Park Service about it. They've not really responded in any meaningful way. They've not taken any action. And they're telling the public how important it is to keep people out of these areas in order to protect the regen. The cows trample the seedlings. They disturb the soils. They eat all the new vegetation that's coming up. They degrade water quality. So it's really disconcerting. I don't know how long this has been going on in Redwood Mountain. I mean, did you see them before the fires at all?
We started going in after the fire, so we know that they've been in there every year after the fire. In the wilderness.
In the wilderness, yeah. And we checked the boundaries, and I've got a slide about this here pretty soon, so we'll talk about that. But we didn't see any fencing along the boundaries, so cows have probably been getting in here for a while. We actually have some FOIAs going. We want to see just how long the public has been reporting, cows in the groves. Well, I talked a little bit about the harms of public lands ranching, but here's a fact sheet. And, it's the largest cause of species endangerment, of water quality degradation. It's about 250 million acres of Forest Service lands that are grazed, and it's like 23 million acres in wilderness. That's about right. So it's a pervasive use, and the cows are out there every year. Logging projects are very harmful, obviously, but if they're going in every 30 or 40 years, let's say, cows are in there every year. So it's a wound that will just not ever heal. Okay, so we did a little analysis here. So here's Kings Canyon National Park. This is the giant Sequoia National Monument. Again, it's about 325,000 acres or so. And you can see these green areas. Those are all livestock grazing allotments inside of the national monument. So when monuments are protected, they're protected for their particular objects. And then so the Sequoia National Monument, it's the sequoias. So, are cows compatible with giant sequoias? I mean, that's sort of questionable, especially after these fires. Here's the northern part, and you can see the monument. It's just entirely cows, and these are all active cattle allotments. All right, here's the trespass. So cattle trespassing is basically where cows aren't supposed to be on the landscape. It could be private or public lands. They could be out of season. There's a certain season, a certain range of dates that a permittee is allowed to have their cattle on the public lands, but also they could get through fencing to get into places. So when we talk about trespass cattle, that's what we're talking about. It's cattle being in places they're not supposed to be. So this is where we took some photo points, but here's right on the edge of the giant Sequoia National Monument going into the national park. And this is where we found there was no fencing at all. So this area is obviously getting mismanaged for a very long time. And there's a cow in the north, kind of the smoking gun, but we all know a cow pie when we see it. So, all right, well, that's the presentation. So thank you.
All right. Well, I'm happy to answer questions for any of the speakers. Yeah.
What do you think in the low intensity fire zones, the Sequoia lead growth is not as effective?
Oh, that's a good question. And everyone here okay?
Yeah.
So the question was, why is the Sequoia regeneration less effective in the lower intensity fire areas? All right. So I should mention this. There are three main things that giant sequoias need in order to effectively reproduce. So one, the cones will not release seeds without significant heat. That's how they evolved. Just don't release seeds. And you need a lot of heat to release seeds. It doesn't have to be high intensity. Even the upper end of low intensity or moderate intensity, it's hot enough to get some seed release. Maybe not as much, but some. That's number one. Number two, giant sequoias need the seedlings to be able to sink their roots into soil. The duff and litter on the forest floor in a giant sequoia grove is incredibly thick. That's basically the decomposing pine needles and twigs and leaves on the forest floor. It's not soil. It's becoming soil, but it's actually not soil yet. So a low intensity fire, moderate intensity fire will consume a portion of the duff and litter, but it will not consume a lot of it. And so you'll get germination, and the seedlings will sink the roots into duff and litter several inches above the soil. Whereas in a high intensity fire patch, it consumes 100% of the duff and litter. And so not only can the seedlings sink their roots into soil, but now they have this thick, incredibly nutrient-rich bed of mineral ash that used to be duff and litter. That's like a super fertilizer that helps those seedlings grow for many, many decades to come. So that's number two. Number three is giant sequoias need an enormous amount of sunlight in the earlier years of their life. And you need fire that's intense enough to kill at least most of the trees in the forest canopy, if not all of them, so they have that sunlight to grow and thrive. And they need all three of those conditions to really grow and thrive best. And so not only do you get a lot more regeneration in those high intensity areas, but you get much more rapid growth rates and much, much higher levels of survival if you have those three things. Yeah.
It sounds like sequoias rely on standardization events. That was what you're saying. And in Western Washington, we have the Van Pelt Guide, and it's pretty widely acknowledged that Douglas firs require a disturbance, logging, or a fire, and then they grow into a dominant cohort, and then they need a fire in order to regenerate, or otherwise it shifts into a different type of forest. It sounds like the agency that manages sequoias doesn't even understand sequoia succession.
Yeah, so the question was, the comment was, it sounds like the agencies that are entrusted to manage giant sequoia groves don't even understand giant sequoia succession. I think that's absolutely true. I think they not only don't understand giant sequoia succession, I don't think they understand the basics of giant sequoia ecology. So, and this goes back to what Mason was saying about wilderness. And wilderness areas are places where nature has primacy. Natural processes are supposed to have primacy. Nature gets to be nature without deciding from some human perspective, this is what we want, or this is what we believe. And it's a really dangerous thing when they try to get around wilderness protections and say, well, it's all about what's natural. And me deciding what's natural. So what the Park Service decided what's natural, and I think they actually believed this initially. I don't think they were from the outset, I don't think initially they were trying to deceive anyone. I think they were just going off their own bias and assumptions. They assumed only lower intensity fire is natural in giant sequoia groves. And then if high intensity fire ever occurred, it would be these tiny little patches that were barely at high intensity that might affect, a few trees here or there. And therefore, bigger patches of high intensity, especially if they include crown fire areas, is inherently unnatural and therefore must be destructive. And therefore, sequoias couldn't possibly be adapted to it or resilient to it. And therefore, it can't possibly regenerate. And therefore, it must have been because of us as humans, because we have so much power. We must have caused this. It's our fault because of fire suppression. And because it's our fault, mea culpa, now it's on us to fix it, right? And that's where it all comes from. And now, well, the Wilderness Act is in the way. So is the Endangered Species Act. So is, so is the National Environmental Policy Act. And so is this group of pesky, troubling scientists that keep saying, maybe you guys did it wrong. And so, that's where it comes to. And then, of course, now we found that everything they assumed was exactly the opposite of what we're finding to be true. And yet, they would have continued to manage on those assumptions and never told the public. And I think they never would have allowed the public back into these groves without a lot of pressure. They finally agreed to lift the closure order this coming July.
So first, I just want to commend you guys. There's something who used to work in Sequoia Kings Canyon. The perspective is very fascinating. It is very much like so many people that believe we don't do anything is treated or don't. So by commending you guys for trying to change the narrative on this, it's really impressive. But I wanted to ask a couple of questions. For Chad and Maya, what's next for research? And then on the legal side of things, what's next for you guys here?
Yeah, you want to.
I know Chad's going to discuss the upcoming work for the summer. I'm very excited because I mentioned during my presentation that I really want to know about when these endangered species, what I call our wild elders, are actually occupying in more than one way, not just hunting, not just passing through, not just resting, but just occupying and denning in these beautiful stags where you see the cavities. Tanya Chi, my colleague, and I documented spotted owls nesting in a cavity created by a broken branch in a fire, 2020 August complex fire in Mendocino. So there's a little hint there. Now I got this marten in Sierra National Forest, and that's not in the grove. But my question is, in the groves, these giant trees with all the habitat that's shown and that I've shown in not just the fallen ones, the ones that are standing for a little while, because we need to show that those standing trees have great value. We know they have, but other than blackback woodpecker, which we know are there, and they're specifically going in the snags. And so there's some cameras that will work to, and I just found this about this 2 days ago. You can actually use a thermal camera to look at a cavity right after sunset to see, or before sunrise, to see if there's a glow of life inside the cavity. You don't know what's going to be in there, but that's, where is it a big glow, like a Fisher sized glow? Is it a smaller glow, like a little, like the alienated woodpecker chick glow, or an egg? So this is incredible. It's like, it brings us so much closer, because what's happening is agencies are not really studying how much life is thriving in these forests. What I'm reading of even the top scientists, and I don't think it's their fault, they're just bypassing these swaths of beautiful habitat and not seeing who's in there. There is a wolverine in Sequoia National Park, and it's a wolverine family. And I just heard from someone in Park Service. And it's actually at the top, close to one of the groves, where below that, if you went down canyon, it would be Redwood Mountain Canyon. So, we've got these hints of species that are on the edge or within or actively using these areas. So that's my push, frankly. And I know that I'm very excited to see these little seedlings and say hello to the fact that they're just growing into saplings and producing cones.
Yeah, thank you. So, in terms of future research, the way we're looking at this as a research team, there's 7 or 8 of us that are involved in every study. Maybe 2 or 3 can't participate, or maybe 1 person can't participate. But there's a team of folks, and actually seems to be growing as well. And we look at this as a longitudinal research effort. We're going to keep coming in every year, every couple of years, and we'll come back to the same sites and document and analyze the course of the natural succession. The narrative was initially, and you're right, the narrative and the view from the Park Service and the Forest Service and U.S. Geological Survey scientists was very, very pessimistic. And that was the narrative they conveyed to the public, to Congress, to the press. My sense is that it was coming from a genuine place. They really were very pessimistic about the fire. They saw the larger high intensity fire patches and they thought, oh my gosh, it's been destroyed. Okay, we didn't see it that way. We took a different view, or at least we were open-minded about what might happen. What we're seeing now is only grounds for optimism. There's no grounds for pessimism at this point, because what's happening out there, what we're showing you here, these are not like exceptions. That's the rule in terms of the regeneration. You can find exceptions where there's less, but you can't find places where there's not. In the large high intensity fire patches, just to put it in perspective, we found giant sequoia regeneration in 100% of our field plots. The Park Service found giant sequoia regeneration in 100% of their field plots in the large high intensity fire patches. That's almost unheard of. But I want to let these folks talk about potential future litigation stuff. To your other question.
Yeah, lucky for me, both our current and former staff attorney are sitting right behind you. So I can plump this question. I feel amazing.
Can you hear me?
I can run this back there too.
I'm Dana. I'm one of the attorneys on the case, like the boss. And right now, I'm screening on an application out of District Court in California. There would have been a precedent setting case on the untrammeled versus natural question. And so we were hoping to get a good opinion out of California on that, because there are more projects, similar projects being proposed, and we've got our eyes on those as well. But just recently, we got an opinion out of the District Court in Montana on this question too. It was a fish poisoning stalking case out of Montana in wilderness that was really, really phenomenal. And the Forest Service has appealed that. We don't know if they'll actually continue on with the appeal, but it's a really great case sort of addressing this false tension, in my mind, between untrammeled conditions and natural conditions in wilderness, and whether the agencies can impose their own desired conditions and sort of wedge that into this, tension between natural and untrammeled. And the District Court in Montana at least said no. They can't do that. The statute says that they can't do that. And so that was applicable to the situation in California. Hopefully we'll get a good opinion out of the court there and be able to use that to challenge some of the other projects that are coming through as well.
How were the fish poisons? How were they poisoned?
Well, fortunately, they didn't get to do it, but it was rotenone.
Oh.
Yeah, and it included areas we broadcast in. Yeah, of rotenone as well. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, you want to say a small bit.
Under the it used this it's
Great question. You leave that to Adam. Are there any videos, any films?
So if you go on the YouTube and you search Sequoias scammed, you'll find the great big giant Sequoia scam video. And I thought about editing this down a bit just because you hear so often that people have short attention spans and all this kind of stuff. But as I was editing it, I really wanted to tell the full story, and I think people are watching it to the end. It's very engaging. Chad does a great job. Kind of as the talking head, as they say. So please share that video around my news so you can show them. But also, as I have the link here, we have an action alert for the Save Our Sequoias Act with QR code. You just take a photo. That QR code will bring you to the action alert. Feel free to just pull it out. It'll go to your members copy of to keep the pressure up. So thanks.
Yeah, just to follow up on that very quickly, and then my last time. It's just please call your members of Congress, your congressional representative in the House, your 2 U.S. senators, tell them to oppose the so-called Save Our Sequoias Act. It's just a destructive logging bill. It's an attack on national parks. It's an attack on wilderness. It's an attack on the national monument. And there's also an action alert link at the end of the great big giant Sequoia scam bill as well.
In 2016, I put together a little film called Searching for the Gold Spot. And it was with a beat up little camera. And it's primarily focusing on Chad's earlier efforts to document blackback woodpeckers nesting in Stein forests. What I think about as foundational forests, like beginning of the reset of fall forests, where they start coming back to life. And subsequent to that, this Sierra Club has no nuclear parks program, and they've put forward a lot of little reels. They insist on those reels being like 1.5 minutes, and then there's several of them about these efforts, including some of Chad's recent work and like On's work on spotted owls. There's just a lot of little reels. So each reel is a nugget of information, if you will. And I think that the target audience is more than people who just look at their phones. And that's why even my nieces are like, Mossy, no more than 1.5 minutes. It's 1 minute, 40 seconds, knock it down by 10 seconds. So those are the ones I have.
I can't reiterate enough how important it is to watch both Adam's film, The Great Big Giant Sequoia Scam, and my film, Searching for Gold Spot. They're both just gems. Let's see. I want to make sure I get to someone.
How do you call this?
What was the Sierra Club?
Stop clear cutting.
Oh,
Sierra Club Stop Clear Cutting. Sierra Club California Stop Clear Cutting campaign. And you can search on that. You should be able to find some links to some of their short films.
They're on Instagram and they're on Facebook.
Yeah. I'll try to get to everybody. Yeah. So.
I have actually, it might be a little off. This is a wild brand. In an urban setting, the family 4 or 5 years ago, which you did in the way House of Sequoia. I guess they're into both. We're playing with Sequoia in urban setting.
Yeah, it's a good question. So this came up in the news story. So another reporter called me and said, "Hey, giant sequoias became really popular in England over a century ago, and so a bunch of people brought sequoia cones back to the UK and planted them in their backyards and city parks and things like that, and they were excited about that." And the reality is, and of course that's true in other places in this country, not just in the West, but also in places in the East. There are giant sequoias and planted and they've grown in some cases. What they're not doing is reproducing. And that's really the thing. Like, your giant sequoia will grow. You can plant it and you can get a giant sequoia to grow if you I mean, they won't always grow, but some will, right? But you will not get a natural reproducing stand. And the only way you get that is in a wild setting. You can't manufacture this. Yeah, you can't engineer it. You can't do it artificially. It just doesn't work that way.
Adam mentioned the agencies are essentially digging in their heels and leaving, pay attention to, you guys at the outer photographing pretty irrefutable phenomenon. And that's the big question, out there. Why they make their heels in, what forces are at play here in terms of motivating this absolute refusal to change their minds. The timber industry is that there are certain conservation groups that are helping greenwash this, or like how it would.
Right. So the question is about the kind of recalcitrance of the agencies, of refusal to accept or hostility to the new scientific findings of what's going on there. Basically, those two also. So.
Or alternate.
Just mentioned Adam because he said that.
It's just this paradigm. It's the momentum of decades and decades of misinformation and fear mongering, and just an unwillingness to really look at the facts. But it's also a lot of money behind this, and Congress rewards the USDA and basic, and the BLM as well. But
and their budgets run out at the end of the year. If they don't spend their money, then it's hard for them to go back they can't really go back and ask for that money again. So they have to put that money to work. They want to show the public that they're doing something to protect us from wildfire, and like they're doing something to keep our forests healthy. But it's really just a backdoor for logging.
It's
For contractors to to be doing this work. So we've really created this massive industry that is really feeding on itself, and it's destroying itself, and it's destroying the natural world in the process. We just have to pull a plug on it and start over entirely. It's out of control.
Just one more thing to add. So sorry to say this, but Save the Redwoods League was given $2 million for the Freeman Creek logging project. And SUCAG, another really great source to go to is SUCAG has ilovetrees.net, and she's documented every single sequoia growth. There's over 80 of them. She's been to all of them, and she's now documenting year after year how Save the Redwoods League is doing this very, very precise logging. They're removing a lot of trees for commercial purposes, and then they're stacking up, which you saw in my slides, stacking up the remainders in a very destructive manner. So destructive that she just actually found a few days ago the evidence for them actually cutting the samplings in a restoration project area. Just think of the irony of cutting the saplings and being paid millions. So my understanding is they have way more than 2 million, because that 2 million was just for one of the groves.
Ghost Forest is a really good book that talks about the Save the Redwood League. They've been greenwashing since more than a century ago.
Yeah, I totally agree. I want to get to just at least two more questions. So I want to make sure I get to that, but just one thought in addition, the money is a big part of it. And it's not just the Forest Service, it's also the Park Service. And, they're getting money, and a lot of it's congressional appropriations. The more of this they do, the more they say there's a problem and only we can fix it, the more money they get to do this stuff. I don't think that's all of it. I think there's also a cultural aspect to it. I think that a lot of these land managers are fundamentally threatened by wildness and natural processes. I think they look at these places like museums, not like dynamic living ecosystems with an evolutionary history with natural disturbance processes that goes back tens of millions of years. That's a longer discussion, but I think it has to be said that that's the conclusion I come to over years of dealing with these folks, that it's a significant part about the money, but there's also a cultural aspect where there's almost, it's not just that fear of wildness and of nature and natural processes, but almost a hatred in many cases. It's in the back, and then next there.
I was curious what you are feeling like these lands and these forests need moving forward, and how can that be supported through human stewardship.
Yeah.
I've been working and talking to people at the Cultural Fire Management Council of Muir Reservation, and from what they've been saying, they've been burning, and it usually takes second or third fire reentry in order to kind of get back to those natural ecosystem processes. And I mean, how is this looking forward? And that's definitely stewardship versus management. Like, management might be central, like something towards our colonial human needs, but stewardship looking towards like what the land needs.
Yeah.
Especially with excluding fire, moving into an uncertain future, more fires, reburns. Like, what can we do?
Yeah, great question. And basically, the question is, what do these ecosystems need moving forward, and how should we be looking at? I'm paraphrasing here, but how should we be looking at fire and different types of fire? So, fire is a natural process in these ecosystems, and the forest ecosystems, including sequoia groves, they still have a deficit of fire. Most forests do in this country. They still have less fire, including high intensity fire. So we have a deficit of fire of all intensities. So broadly speaking, I support burning in ecosystems that have too little fire. My number one thing that I'd like to see more of is what we call wildland fire use, just letting lightning strikes burn without trying to suppress them, because you're going to get some mixed intensity effects, and that's natural and that's healthy. There are certain places, context for prescribed burning that makes sense in certain land management designations. I support indigenous cultural burning and removing administrative barriers and reducing administrative barriers to cultural burning. In particular, in a place like wilderness, I really think, again, because of it's the one place in the landscape where wildness and nature get to have primacy, where we're not supposed to be tending and managing like a garden. It's a place where I would like to see natural processes like fire play out on their own as they will from natural lightning strikes. And mostly a place like that, I just want to just get out of the way in terms of management and then study it, enjoy it, appreciate the beauty and appreciate the wildness and have the other conversations in other parts of the landscape. But basically, as far as the broader landscape goes, it's about fire. It's not about cutting trees. It's certainly not about rolling back environmentalism. Okay, last question. I think we need to do that.
Yeah, one to note for everyone here. The other question about conditions management. So the note is that in the aftermath of the Hardup's Cat Creek's fire, the presiding judge of the District of New Mexico, Brown, ruling in a case against FEMA, who was refusing to pay property damage to all the property owners that made two important findings. One was that intentional burning as practiced by the Forest Service is a public nuisance by law. And secondly, it's an abnormally dangerous activity, otherwise known as ultra-hazardous activity, for which the responsible party or parties are be held strictly liable for all harm. And that's just a December 2024 decision. And there's a lot of other stuff in there that's very useful to us in all of our other work under the APA. Now, my question about conditions-based management, I'm aware of that district of the last decision a 3 years ago, and it's telling us about finding conditions-based management was felony. But what else, where's it at now in terms of the legal skirmishing about that? Because it's a scam. It's just a dodge.
Yeah, good question. So the question is basically about what's the current state of affairs in terms of what the court decisions about conditions-based management, because we heard about the dangers of that. And I've been tracking some of the case law on that. There's actually been a few pretty good recent cases, very recent cases on that. So I'm kind of optimistic about the trajectory even after the 7-county decision. But Mason, if you want to speak to that.
You can speak to the.
Okay.
I'll speak to some of the things I'm seeing.
Although they could have them right out of first.
There's been more recently, and some of the Northern Rock saying this.
Yeah. So I'm not. Chad, you might want to talk speak to some of the cases and the case law. But as far as sort of what I'm seeing, so I work primarily in what we call brush fires. So I'm looking at all the project proposals and things like that. And it's what I mentioned, like in the Shawnee, we're seeing a lot of under these condition-based management sort of structure to these proposals. We're seeing a lot of what was proposed sort of in Western states. So, for example, in the Sierra and Sequoia prescribed ground project, it was 2.5 million acres, including wilderness sort of lumped in, logging and.
Are they allowed to do that? What's the pushback?
Well, that's a good question. I think that different districts have found different rulings depending on where you are and the challenge.
Thanks.
Yeah. But basically, there are some good signs, but still in play in litigation. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.